When talking about the archaeological timeline of Ohio, it's important to note that when discussing the different cultures of this series, Ohio's Ancient History, we aren't discussing new tribes or groups of people necessarily. We are discussing the descendants of the same people, and we are essentially highlighting their evolution throughout the course of history. A way for the modern mind to perceive and communicate ancient man's modern world. We are able to distinctly identify these time periods and label them because of the archaeological record. Of course, as we progress down this timeline, the distinctions become more apparent and more unique based on region. But for Ohio's earliest known ancestors, the only thing we truly have to separate these evolutions is the style of artifacts they used and the earthworks that they created. Now, of course, there are more differences than just the artifacts when it comes to differentiating the Archaic period from the Paleo-Indian period. Things like environmental changes, several technological advancements, a rapidly increasing population, and various social transformations likely influenced by said population growth. Now, this extensive duration does not indicate over 7,000 years of cultural stagnation. No, on the contrary, it marks a dynamic era where small nomadic groups evolved into larger settled communities doing activities like producing pottery and cultivating small gardens, as well as doing magnificent things like creating beautiful earthworks that we still marvel at to this very day. The 7,000-year-long archaic continuum poses a real challenge for archaeologists who prefer to segment the prehistoric record into more manageable time units. During the Archaic period, there are no sudden transitions where one distinct technology supplements another. The significant cultural shifts of this era occurred gradually, partly due to the establishment of a remarkably stable climate following the chaotic fluctuations of the ice ages. Despite this gradual change, archaeologists find it helpful to divide the Archaic period into three segments, somewhat blandly naming them the Early, the Middle, and the Late Archaic, all three of which we will delve into deeply in this video. Now, the Archaic period was, of course, spanning more than 7,000 years, is the lengthiest epoch in Ohio's archaeological history. It began at the conclusion of the Ice Age, and continued until the advent of agriculture. Now, during this extensive period, there was significant cultural transformation as communities adjusted to evolving environmental conditions. This era is marked by a wide variety of artifacts and changes their way of living. The Archaic period in general can be defined by three main factors: climate change, population growth, and new technology. Since the Archaic period was at the end of the Ice Age, the climate of Ohio became much warmer and drier, similar to the seasonal weather patterns we experience today. This change in climate would have also presumably allowed population growth to happen, or at least had a major effect on it. There was less pressure on mobilizing from traversing those glaciated landscapes that their forefathers had to before, and they were beginning to settle in more local areas, beginning to hunt the same lands in a seasonal manner. There would have also presumably been more nuts, berries, and other plant life to forage as the weather was beginning to warm. In fact, we know that population growth ensued in the early Archaic period because of the overhunting of the megamammals, which led to nearly all of their extinction. But we also know that the Archaic period produced major population growth because of the sheer amount of artifacts that we find in this era. New technologies were introduced in the form of different spear points, tools, pottery, and they would have also begun to build shelters. We'll delve into all of this and more soon. Quick note, this increase in technology is another reason we find so many artifacts based in the Archaic period. On top of it also being the longest period of Ohio's ancient history, makes it the perfect storm for archaeologists and anthropologists studying this period. The Early Archaic Period. The Early Archaic period's climate would have experienced pretty drastic changes in the temperature. This climate change and warming of the planet during the end of the Ice Age would have prompted the rise of meadows, pocket prairies, and oak hickory forests that dominated the landscape. The early archaic natives of Ohio wouldn't have relied heavily on agriculture. They were still hunter-gatherers at heart. They would have probably begun to recognize agricultural patterns, and they would have likely returned to seasonal agricultural spots that they could reforage every year. There's evidence of archaic peoples using controlled burns to eliminate the threat of wildfires and to propagate fire-resistant trees that bore edible foods. There have been tons of different species of nuts that are found in many early archaic sites. They would have probably moved with the seasons in response to the changing availability of food, probably changing many spots many times a year, but staying in the same general region because even in the early archaic period, they were beginning to build houses. Now, these quote-unquote houses would have been very, very small shelters, probably, built with wooden frames and covered with hides, tree bark, or mats woven from reeds and grasses. The regions they traversed would have been very heavily reliant on the waterways, especially the Ohio River and its tributaries. One way that archaeological record backs this up is the increased traffic in the Ohio River Valley. That traffic comes in the appearance of artifacts, and those artifacts are ground stone tools. Ground stone tools in this region indicate a larger presence of heavier woodworking needs, things like building canoes and building those temporary houses. So these tools would have been pretty heavy and more problematic for a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So the presence of more and more of these ancient tools being around would be a pretty big indicator of the transition to a more regionally locked-in seasonal hunter-gatherer culture. Now let's get down and dirty, and let's talk about some weapons. And there's a lot of weapons to talk about when it comes to the early archaic period, because they evolved quite a bit from their predecessors, the Paleo-Indians. Now, like all points in these varying time periods, the styles would of course have changed, and it's possible many of the points and artifacts we find from the Archaic period aren't even necessarily intended as weapons, but rather knives and blades used as tools. One thing is for certain though, that if you were an early Archaic person, you would have your atlatl close by your side no matter what. Now, what is an atlatl, you may ask? Well, an atlatl is actually a name coined from the Aztec Empire, and it's a rod of flexible wood with a hook at one end and a handle on the other end that they would have a smaller rigid wooden rod that they would use to gain leverage to be able to throw it. Now, here's a great video demonstration courtesy of Josh Angelini and MPS of how a native would have thrown an atlatl. Now, the atlatl is nothing new to the early Archaic people, and it probably came all the way from before humans even set foot in America. But what the early Archaic people did do to the atlatl was very, very revolutionary for their time, and it completely buffed the effectiveness of this ancient weapon. Now, when I say buff, if you're a gamer, you'll know what I mean. I mean improve drastically. And what they did was extremely simple. Simple yet effective. They began adding weight to the weapon so it could travel at greater distance and greater speed. The very first atlatl weights that we find are usually rounded and more oval shaped. They would have either drill holes or etch grooves that would allow them to tie it down to the atlatl. They would then use cordage or sinew for the tying process. Now, an interesting note about the atlatl weights is that somewhere down the line they began making them so elaborate and massive that they would actually serve no practical purpose. So this would have served as some sort of ceremonial or maybe religious or maybe even had a social function to it. Now, I know a couple of hunters today and a ton of fishermen today who do it just for sport, and every single one of them is superstitious in some way about the hunt or fish of that day. And I'm sure many of you are the same way, including myself. And I'm sure that ancient man was no different, especially when they relied on this for their livelihood. They probably performed ceremonies and carried sacramental items to invoke or manifest the things they needed or wanted in life. Now let's get back to the religious thing, because it's pretty important when talking about these mysterious ancient people. The fact that there was an ancient religion is just very profound and mysterious. Now, the presence of marine shells in an early archaic burial site located in Indiana, known as the Jurger site, is notable for this religious cause, and notable as a ceremonial lifestyle, indicating that even in the early archaic period, people valued and acquired rare items from distant regions. Possessing such unusual ornaments likely conferred higher status. The practice of burying these valuable items with the dead suggests a belief in an afterlife, where the deceased would have needed them in some way, or perhaps it was some sort of honorary death ceremony. Now, the custom of cremation might explain the scarcity of burials from this period, the Early Archaic Period, although the population in Ohio and surrounding areas was just increasing at this time, so it remained relatively low during the Early Archaic era, and so consequently, burials from this time are expected to be pretty dang rare. Now, some of the shells and the copper ornaments found in these burial sites reach as far north as the Great Lakes region and as far south as the Gulf of Mexico. So that indicates a very, very vast trade network, probably one of the greatest of its time.